Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Well, they think it's all over, but now is it? Boris Johnson has almost clawed his way to the top of the Tory leadership greasy poll. But even if he makes it next Tuesday, does this guarantee him any longevity as Prime Minister? Her Majesty the Queen may send for him next week, but could the House of Commons send him packing by refusing him a vote of confidence come the autumn? We're unlikely to know until then, as the honourable members are about to decant to the seaside, or perhaps to enjoy their last visa-free escapades across the more salubrious parts of the European continent. However, it will be all systems go when Parliament returns, with Prime Minister Johnson threatening no deal by Halloween if the rest of Europe doesn't crumble like his Tory leadership opponents. Today we ask two top commentators to tell us what the Ides of October might hold for longevity of the Johnson premiership. What would Prime Minister Johnson mean for Britain at home and abroad? And is Scotland going to be his greatest political challenge? When we looked at the race for the Tory leadership last month, our top Tory tipster Peter Oborne successfully forecast the two who would reach the final ballot, and then suggested that Johnson would cross the line into Downing Street. However, Peter also suggested that all might not be plain sailing in securing the support of the House of Commons.
20 Tories who say we're not going to serve under Johnson or vote for him, that he can't.
Now we bring him back for a discussion from the blue corner on what happens now. And he's joined from the yellow corner by commentator and former Liberal MP Lembit Opik as they look forward with Alex to a tumultuous political autumn.
What I think we can say is that this October is going to be the biggest political month in hundreds of years in Britain. It's as momentous as 1688. You know, it's peaceful, but it's momentous. It's massive. The biggest month in British politics of any of our lifetimes.
What Boris Johnson could do to avoid the points that Peter has made is simply make it impossible for Parliament to function. So it literally means that Parliament doesn't sit. It's a big risk, though, because, turning to your other point, the last chap who tried it was Charles I, and he literally lost his head. So he stopped Parliament, and he lost his position and lost his life as a result. I'm not sure that's going to happen this time, but Boris would be playing a pretty dangerous game there, because he does have enemies in his own party, and you can see Labour champing at the bit to trip him up. And so if he's going to start playing hardball with his own Remain backbench at the same time as having a very, very angry Labour Party at the moment, then that could go horribly wrong for him, and that could foreshorten his premiership.
And we also take a view from Scottish columnist Martin Hannon on whether Boris Johnson's political legacy might be the end of the Union.
Well, Alec, you and I both know that independence for Scotland is inevitable. It's just a matter of whether it's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It's coming.
So plenty to discuss then. Now over to Alex in Victoria Gardens outside Parliament.
I'm now joined outside the Palace of Westminster by two of our three wise men. Firstly, Peter Oborne in the blue corner, and in the yellow corner, Lembit Opik, the former Liberal MP. Now, Peter, first, I have to turn to you. When you were forecasting as a tipster the Tory leadership race, you were right. It was going to be a hunt against Johnson for the climax, and it looks like you were right that Johnson would get over the line and win. But you also said he might not become Prime Minister, or if he did, he might not be long for the office. Are you prepared to concede now that at least he's going to get his feet under the table?
Yeah, he will get his feet under the table, I would think, barring sort of something spectacular from Mrs May. She has recommendations to make to the Queen about her successor. If she feels that Mr Johnson can't get a majority of the House of Commons, then she may give surprising advice. It's still open.
You don't really think? I mean, look, she's been hyperactive she's been more active in the last 3 weeks than she's been in the last 3 years.
But what that does bring you to is the issue: can Mr Johnson command a majority of the House of Commons? That is the huge question. It really sort of looms massively over his premiership. In particular, can he get that majority for no deal? And we are talking about a very short space of time. You know, he's promised Britain out of the European Union by Halloween, 31st of October. And can he command that Commons majority when you can see there's a lot of signs inside the Conservative Party that quite a number of Conservative MPs may not back him? That is the issue.
But that challenge, that direct challenge, is not likely to come before the recesses. It's more likely when Parliament gets back in September. Would I be right in that?
That is what the situation looks like at the moment, yes. So in other words, what I think we can say is that this October is going to be the biggest political month in hundreds of years in Britain. It's as momentous as 1688. You know, it's peaceful, but it's momentous. It's massive. The biggest month in British politics of any of our lifetimes.
Well, talking about history, Lambert, let's just talk about proroguing Parliament for the benefit of our viewers around the world. What on earth does that mean? And who was last to try that trick?
Two good questions. It's a fancy word for basically stopping Parliament from functioning for a while, really until the next Queen's speech. So what Boris Johnson could do to avoid the points that Peter has made is simply make it impossible for Parliament to function. So it literally means that Parliament doesn't sit. It's a big risk, though, because, turning to your other point, the last chap who tried it was Charles I, and he literally lost his head. So he stopped Parliament, and he lost his position and lost his life as a result. I'm not sure that's going to happen this time, but Boris would be playing a pretty dangerous game there, because he does have enemies in his own party, and you can see Labour champing at the bit to trip him up. And so if he's going to start playing hardball with his own Remain backbench at the same time as having a very, very angry Labour Party at the moment, then that could go horribly wrong for him, and that could foreshorten his premiership.
And nobody knows more about the tenor of the whole Conservative Party than you do, Peter. Is proroguing a goer with people like Rory Stewart or John Major, for that matter?
Well, Mr. Major slightly ostentatiously and I think absurdly has said he's going to challenge us in the courts. But I think that Parliament wouldn't allow it itself.
But that would be if we think about it just for a second, that would be a former Prime Minister Conservative challenging an incoming Conservative Prime Minister in the High Courts of England. That would be something.
So what you're going to have, though, is Boris Johnson claiming popular legitimacy, making himself the champion of the people against Parliament. That takes us into a terrifying new political environment. He will certainly have the endorsement and the support of his friend or his ally, Nigel Farage, who are going to very likely see something which makes quite a number of people inside the Conservative Party very nervous. It's an alliance between the Brexit Party outside Parliament and the Conservative Party, or Johnson's Conservative Party, inside Parliament. And some people will say that Parliament is betraying Brexit, is betraying the people. Others will say Parliament is doing the job which Parliament is there to do.
It's not impossible, as you say, that John Major, former Prime Minister, will challenge, maybe not publicly, he might just let it be known that he's on that side, to challenge the no-deal Brexit. And there are games you can play there as well. You can start various bits of sub-legislation which really messes up proroguing.
Some people suggest even this afternoon there might be an amendment to the Northern Irish legislation which makes proroguing more difficult.
It doesn't make it impossible, but the ploy here is, it's nothing to do with Northern Ireland, it's to do with proroguing, to put something into the system that really technically has to be finished before you can shut down Parliament. But it's a very grey area. It's hundreds of years since Prime Ministers tried to do this before, and it could all go horribly wrong for either side.
The opposition parties, they look pretty happy with the prospect of a Johnson leadership. I mean, your old gang in the Liberal Democrat, they'll be kind of rubbing their hands as they see the centre ground of politics opening up. And the other opposition parties look pretty smug as well. Are they right to be feeling that way?
I think the Lib Dems are right to see an opportunity here. The recent European elections showed that what the public hated was uncertainty. They voted for the Brexit Party because there's a clue in the name. It was all about Brexit on any terms. And the Lib Dems said, we are absolutely Remain. Now, that didn't work for them a couple of years ago, but it worked really well for them. Record number of MEPs. And that centre ground seems to be the danger area. Now, Boris hasn't got that problem. He is quite clearly on the Brexit side. The alliances that you've been talking about with the Brexit Party don't help him at all in Parliament, because he's got to deal with his hundreds of Conservative MPs, lots of them them would like to see him trip up and wouldn't be sad for a crash and burn Boris Johnson leadership.
How about the Labour Party, the main opposition party in Parliament? Is there a chance that an incoming Boris Johnson leadership will polarise politics to the extent that will allow Labour to put their internal divisions behind them, or are things too far gone for Labour?
Well, Labour is in more of a civil war than the Conservatives, and I don't think it would. I mean, we're now having Labour MPs coming forward and saying they would support no deal Brexit, and the party itself is at war. This war between the Corbynites, or Corbyn, and Tom Watson. The temptation for Mr. Johnson will be to take advantage of that and go for a general election.
Wouldn't that pull Labour together? I mean, nothing like a general election, the smoke in the battlefield to pull people together.
Maybe that would be a salvation. And of course, Mr. Corbyn has a very good record in general elections. He did very, very well in 2 or 3 years ago when he ended May's majority.
Now, this feeling among the opposition parties, I mean, the Scottish Nationalists think Johnson's going to be a recruiting sergeant. The Liberals see an opportunity. Labour thinks he might be their salvation and a chance to get an election. Is there a chance they might be underrating Boris? That Boris might turn out to be more of a success than the other parties believe?
There is a chance of it. What we're seeing here is that polarisation, which you're saying, which the public demonstrated in that vote in the European elections. But he's also an unknown quantity because he is a maverick. That can play very well with the public fed up with boring grey politicians. But if he trips up, and he's done that a number of times, then that's the real danger area for the Conservatives. Lib Dems will be pleased that that polarisation has worked because they can be the overtly Remain party. Labour's got a problem here because it's not clear whether they are Remain or Brexit. And if Boris plays that smart, he can exacerbate the divisions which Pete have just described.
There's another point here, which is Boris has become the British Trump. Whether by design or by mistake, he is the British Trump. He's positioning, and that means Trump was underrated, and nobody really understood the power of Trump among the liberal media, among the opposition parties, among his own party. And there he became, you can lie as much as you like and get away with it. You can have as chaotic and disreputable a private life as you like and get away with it. You cannot trip up, literally, because you invent a new set of rules for yourself. And so you're going to see Boris try and do that over the next few weeks. It's going to be an attempt to mimic and duplicate Trump and get a great trade deal with Trump. And it's basically saying, Britain, do you want to be America with all of that means, or do you want to be Europe with what that means? And I think that is the big... Boris, who was an American citizen until a few years ago, will say, Britain, do you want to be America?
Well, when we come back after the break, we're going to pursue the idea of Boris Johnson as a mini-me Donald Trump, and whether or not Boris can actually bag Brexit. Join us then.
Welcome back. Alex is discussing what the autumn might hold for new Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Could he be the shortest-term Premier in history? Or can he pull off the big Brexit deal which eluded Theresa May?
Now, Labour OPIC, Peter Oborne just said that Boris is copying the Trump playbook. Might that lead us into a war in the Middle East with Iran following Donald Trump?
I don't think he's copying Donald Trump's playbook. He happens to simply read from that same playbook. They're quite similar characters in that sense. So it's not so much mimicking as happening to be the same sort of character. And that's maybe playing well for him. In terms of what that means regarding, let's say, the Middle East and Iran, it's hard to know. I think probably he will see this great, huge, rushing opportunity to be the restorer of the special relationship. So it's very hard to imagine Donald Trump and Boris being at loggerheads publicly, especially in the first few weeks or months of his leadership. And the temptation to be a successful war leader is always an enormous one, as Margaret Thatcher and others and Tony Blair has proved.
Peter, will this work as a tactic? I mean, the prime ministers who've looked at the special relationship. Harold Macmillan was basking in the glow of John F. Kennedy. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan was a a considerable president, particularly his international reputation. I mean, is it going to actually work being too close to Donald Trump? Is that something that's going to be popular across the United Kingdom?
I think it's a very profound question. It's not like Harold Macmillan and John F. Kennedy. Trump is a racist, he's a thug, he is a very dangerous and unpleasant individual that no honest and decent person would want to have anything to do with. And he also appears to be embarked on an illegal course of pursuing war against Iran. And now, supposing that suddenly gets on the agenda, and it just could happen like that, there'll be a plane shot down, an episode, Boris suddenly has to decide, am I going to be with Trump in waging war, a real war against Iran, or am I going to back away? And if I back away, what does that mean for my Brexit deal? So we are in a very unstable and very dangerous international environment. And I think that, and does Boris have the ability and imagination to do that? He was a failure as foreign secretary. He failed to deal with the Yemen. He failed to confront the genocide in Myanmar. He did a complete U-turn over Syria, having originally promised not to, that Assad could stay. He then immediately turned tail on that when he got into the Foreign Office. So he
was re-elected as Mayor of London.
Yes, but Mayor of London, I know for you that's a foreign policy, but as far as Boris was concerned, it was domestic.
Well, on this question, let's get to the elephant in the room. Can Boris bag Brexit? That's the question.
Potentially he can. As with Iran, I think it would be catastrophic for us to follow the US, but Boris won't be making that necessarily that calculation. He'll be saying, what do I feel will make me look like a good leader? Now the same goes for Brexit. He has no options. He's got some options with Iran, and I hope he does back off from supporting Trump, but he probably won't. With Brexit, he's got no options. He's absolutely pinned his colours to the Brexit mast. Deal or no deal, we have to be out by Halloween. If we're not out by the 31st of October, he is in the same sort of situation as Theresa May found herself after 3 years, but he'll have done it in 3 months. And the Brexit party will be waiting in the wings. Farage has proved he can create a party and 6 weeks later win an election. Then Brexit party's got a serious chance of beginning to leech enough votes away from the Conservatives to do real damage. I'm not sure how many seats they'd get, but they could steal that majority and Labour could get in by default. Those are the stakes we're talking about. But Boris has to deliver this. I think he probably can deliver something, but it could be a big mess. It might only be Brexit in word.
But isn't there a chance for Boris Johnson? I mean, the Commission, the new president of the Commission, she can be under no illusions whatsoever. He means no deal, and he absolutely means it by Halloween. And a lot of the Tories who said they were against it are turning tail already in the House of Commons. Isn't there a chance that Boris can charm and bluff his way through?
You're right. These completely pathetic Tories who are utterly adamantly against no deal, about like the pathetic, like little Matthew Hancock and Amber Rudd and other lesser folk like Skidmore.
How about the current Chancellor, soon to be out of office, presumably Mr. Hammond? Is he made of sterner stuff?
I think so. I think that Hammond has played a very interesting game. He hasn't stood for the leadership, but he's been very, very influential behind the scenes. I think you should watch him. I think that the most likely thing is Boris will not be able to get Brexit by the 31st of October, and that he will then be forced out.
I think he's going to have to deliver Brexit, even if it's just in word. Even if he just says, we've left the European Union, and everyone says, nothing's changed, doesn't matter, we've left the European Union. If he doesn't do that, he's on resignation row the day after.
Now, I want yes/no answers to this very last question. Firstly, will Boris bag Brexit by Halloween? And secondly, will he still be Prime Minister at Christmas? You
yes
first, Lambert.
Yes to the first and yes to the second.
No to the first, no to the second.
Well, there we are, we're in agreement.
But I am the man who predicted that Boris would win and Hunt would come second.
Your luck's running out, Peter.
So there we are. Two divergent opinions, and who knows what's going to happen.
One of the first things in the new Prime Minister's entry will be the situation in Scotland, where Johnson hasn't been popular even with the Scots Tories. Alex asked the national columnist Martin Hannon whether a Johnson premiership is likely to most resemble that of his hero Churchill, or rather that of Lord North, who lost the American colonies.
So Martin Hannon, Prime Minister Johnson, will he be a latter-day Lord North? Will the arch-unionists end up losing Scotland?
Well, the answer to that, actually, if you look back, it was the king at the time that the colonies were lost was George III, and we all know he was mad. Well, I think the madness of Boris Johnson will cost him the Union.
A lot of the Scots Tories were very leery about Johnson. In fact, there was a campaign of a rude-sounding name to stop him just last year. Ruth Davidson, David Mundell were associated with the Stop Johnson faction. Now that he's on the threshold of number 10, are they changing their position?
No, not. I think that Ruth Davidson still would favour Jeremy Hunt at this point in time, but she knows he's going to lose, so they're positioning themselves so that they can carry on in their jobs after Boris becomes Prime Minister, as he certainly will.
And how about in the grassroots of the Scottish Tories? Is there a lot of worry, or are there a faction who think Boris is just what the Scottish Tories need?
There is a faction of that nature, but let's face it, Alec, it's the democratic deficit. There's only 9,000 or so Scottish Tories. They will get to decide who the next Prime Minister is out of a population of 5.4 million Scots. It's a democratic deficit and a microcosm. No matter what happens here in Scotland, no matter how they vote, England will dictate who the next Prime Minister is, and it'll be English Tories who will overwhelmingly vote for Boris Johnson.
Is there a danger that the opposition parties, rubbing their hands at the prospect of a Johnson premiership, may be miscalculating? Is there a danger for them that he might turn out to be quite successful?
I don't think there's very much danger of that, because if you look at what Johnson has got ahead of him, he has an almost impossible task to get any sort of a deal through Parliament. He then, as he said, I have to take his word for it, we will be out of the European Union on October the 31st. At that point, the mandate kicks in, and the Scottish Parliament has given the Scottish Government the power to seek a second independence referendum, and it will be sought.
But what happens when Boris Johnson says no, just as Theresa May said, now is not the time?
That's the whole issue, isn't it? What will Johnson do? Will he say no to a Section 30 referendum, or will he see political sense and realise that Scotland and England are now on totally separate paths, and he should actually realise that, and he does realise it, I'm pretty certain he does, and allow a second independence referendum fully backed by Westminster as well as Holyrood.
Now, if you were a betting man, and I know you are, what price would you give on the longevity of a Boris Johnson premiership?
I wouldn't be taking my mortgage out on it lasting any more than a year. I can foresee a vote of confidence coming very quickly, because I don't think that he will be able to get a deal that's acceptable to Parliament, and we already know Westminster Parliament does not want and will not have a no-deal situation. He therefore will have to go to the country, and hopefully somebody very wise will tell him so. And if you think by that I mean Her Majesty the Queen, well, that's exactly who I mean.
And on the same vein, what odds would you give on the longevity of the union between Scotland and England?
Well, Alec, you and I both know that independence for Scotland is inevitable. It's just a matter of whether it's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. It's coming. And my bet at the moment is it'll happen in my lifetime. And hopefully I've got a good few years to go yet. But I can foresee it now within the next decade.
But isn't there a danger in the Scottish Nationalists and the SNP putting all their eggs in the Johnson basket?
Well, it's being dictated to us. That's the whole point. We have no choice in it. We're getting Boris Johnson, whether we like him or not, and most of us don't want him. But that's what we're getting, and the Scottish Nationalists really have to plan ahead now for a second referendum campaign, because to me it just seems that that is the only sensible, logical conclusion of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister.
Now, Martin Hannon, the National stands out from the pack in being the only independence-supporting paper in Scotland. I'm interested in what your fellow commentators in the Unionist-supporting press, what are they thinking about Boris Johnson? Are they worried that he might break the Union?
Well, here we are on a nice sunny day in Edinburgh, and unlike some of my colleagues, I don't think that the Unionist commentators are stuck away in a dark cavern minting ever new ways of calling the SNP bad and decrying nationalism. I think that there's been a very subtle but very definite change of opinion on the part of some commentators, I emphasise some, who have been questioning Exactly what is Brexit and Boris Johnson doing to the Union? And thank goodness for that. It's about time.
Now, you paint a picture of Scotland being on a road to independence, but couldn't a Boris Johnson premiership be the start of a reversal of that trend? Couldn't he grab powers back from the Scottish Parliament?
Well, all I can say to that, Alec, is let him try, because the one thing you do not do to a Scottish nation is you don't take away something that it already has. We gave away our independence in 1707, and we will regain it. But in the meantime, if Boris Johnson tries any of that funny stuff, then Scotland's road out of the UK will be accelerated.
Martin Hannon from Edinburgh, thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye, Alec.
Many people have invested a great deal of hope in a Johnson victory. Unfortunately for Boris, not all of them are paid-up Conservatives. For Labour, this is an opportunity to put their own internal difficulties to one side in an imminent and polarised election. For the Liberal Democrats, a Johnson ascension opens up the middle ground and allows a sustained recovery from the coalition blues which have beset them in recent years. For the SNP, a Tory leader unacceptable to even Scottish Tories is the best independence recruiting sergeant they could possibly wish for. For the insurgent Brexit Party, Johnson and Prime Minister is the ultimate each-way bet. Either Boris bags Brexit, in which case they win their cause, or he fails, in which case they can then succeed politically. Never in the field of politics have so many invested so much hope in political failure. Of course, it could be that all of the opposition hopes will be dashed. With a little flim-flam and a dash of whiff-waff, Johnson might be a rip-roaring, spiffing success, defying the odds, the parliamentary arithmetic, and all rational consideration, and succeed. He might blunder and charm his way to success, where better politicians have failed. In which case, as many opponents within and without the Conservative Party would be left to rue the day that they relied on the prospective Prime Minister's manifest failings as opposed to their own strengths and principles to achieve their aims. Next week, we return to the political reaction to the European citizens effectively disenfranchised in the recent elections and ask key parliamentarians in Westminster and in Europe where the government will be held to account. Until then, from Tasmina and me and all at the show, it's goodbye for now.